The silence came first. Not the kind that settles gently after a long life well lived. Not the respectful hush of a theater after the final curtain call. This was different. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. This was the kind of silence that hits you in the chest before your mind can even process the headline. The kind that makes you reread the same sentence over and over, hoping you misunderstood it. How does a man whose career was built on laughter, dialogue, and unforgettable human moments end in a story no one was prepared to tell? How does a Hollywood icon go from directing scenes that defined generations to becoming the center of a tragedy that leaves more questions than answers? And perhaps the hardest question of all, how does a family say goodbye when the world refuses to stop watching? This is not just the story of a funeral. This is the story of a final goodbye overshadowed by shock, grief, and an unbearable collision between public legacy and private devastation. Because when the news broke that Rob Reiner and his wife, Michelle Singer Reiner, had been found dead in their home, the reaction wasn't just sadness. It was disbelief. Disbelief that quickly turned into confusion. Confusion that turned into speculation. And speculation that spiraled faster than the family could possibly keep up with. For decades, Rob Reiner had been a familiar presence in American culture, not just as a filmmaker, not just as an actor, not just as a political voice, but as a figure people felt they knew. His work played in living rooms. His lines were quoted at dinner tables. His movies became emotional landmarks in people's lives. And Michelle wasn't just his wife. She was his producing partner, his collaborator, the person who helped shape the projects, the conversations, the life they built together. They were a unit. So when that unit was suddenly gone, ripped out of the narrative without warning, it didn't feel real. It felt like a mistake, a rumor, something that would be corrected with time. But time didn't soften it. Time made it heavier. Within hours, the story stopped being about loss and started being about details. And once details enter the picture, grief no longer gets to exist quietly. The public wanted answers. The media wanted angles. And the family? The family was still trying to breathe. Imagine that for a moment. Imagine losing both parents at once. Not after a long illness. Not after a goodbye. But suddenly. Violently. Publicly. And then imagine learning that the story doesn't end there. That it fractures into something even more unthinkable. Because as statements emerged, one name changed the entire gravity of the situation. Their son. A detail so devastating it feels almost unreal to say out loud. At that moment, the tragedy stopped being something the public could process neatly. It became something messy, something morally uncomfortable, something that forced people to confront the limits of curiosity. And yet, curiosity did not stop. It intensified. Every word released by authorities was dissected. Every sentence from the family was analyzed for meaning, tone, and omission. People searched for signs, for clues, for someone to blame, for a version of the story that made sense. But grief doesn't follow logic, and funerals don't wait for closure. A week after Rob and Michelle were found dead, their surviving children released a statement that was both brief and heartbreaking. It didn't offer answers. It didn't satisfy speculation. And that was the point. They spoke of unimaginable pain. They spoke of loss that words could not contain. They spoke not as public figures, but as children who had lost their parents and their sense of normalcy in a single blow. And then came the line that mattered most. They would share information about a memorial service at a later date. That single sentence carried enormous weight, because planning a memorial is not just about logistics. It's about narrative. It's about memory. It's about deciding what version of a life and a death will be preserved when the person can no longer speak for themselves. And in this case, the stakes were unbearable. How do you honor a father when the circumstances of his death dominate every conversation? How do you celebrate a life without inviting speculation into the room? How do you grieve privately when the world insists on watching? The family asked for compassion, for humanity, for restraint. They asked that their parents be remembered not for the way they died, but for the way they lived, for the love they gave, for the lives they touched. It was a plea, not a press strategy. And yet, even that plea became part of the story. Because in high-profile tragedies, silence is interpreted as strategy. Grief is interpreted as messaging. And every pause is filled by someone else's voice. What makes this moment especially haunting is the timing. The memorial had not yet been announced. Details were still forthcoming. And looming over all of it was an impending court date that ensured this story would not fade quietly into the background. So the funeral, or memorial, was never going to be just a farewell. It was going to be a moment suspended between mourning and uncertainty, between remembrance and reality, between what the family wanted the world to see and what the world was determined to uncover. And then there's the legacy question. What happens to a legacy when a life ends in tragedy? Does the final chapter redefine everything that came before it? Or does it force us to confront an uncomfortable truth? That people can be extraordinary, loving, flawed, and vulnerable all at once. Rob Reiner spent his career telling stories about human complexity, about friendship, about love, about conflict, about moral choice. Now, his own story has become one that resists simple interpretation, and the memorial service, still unrevealed, has become the symbolic battleground for all of it. Because when the family steps forward to say goodbye, they won't just be mourning a father and a mother. They'll be facing a world that wants answers they may never have. So the question isn't just how Rob Reiner will be remembered. The question is who gets to decide. And as the date approaches, as details remain scarce, and as emotions continue to boil beneath the surface, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. This goodbye is not the end of the story. It's the moment where everything becomes even more complicated. Because behind the scenes, tensions are forming, expectations are clashing, and choices are being made that the public won't fully understand until much later. And when those choices finally come into focus, what they reveal may change everything. Did this really just happen? That was the question echoing across Hollywood, across newsrooms, across living rooms, across phones lighting up in the middle of ordinary afternoons. Not a whisper, not a rumor from a shadowy corner of the internet. A confirmed report that landed like a physical blow. Rob Reiner was dead. So was his wife, Michelle Singer Reiner. Two names that had lived for decades in the public eye, now suddenly paired with a word no one was ready to read. Found. Dead. Home. Brentwood. How does that sentence even exist? How does a man whose voice helped define American film, comedy, and cultural debate for generations become the subject of a breaking news alert that feels more like a nightmare than reality? And why did the story refuse to stop there? Because almost immediately, the shock wasn't just about loss. It was about timing, about context, about details that didn't line up with the way people expected this chapter to end. Hollywood is used to death. That sounds cold, but it's true. The industry has seen legends pass away after long careers. There are prepared tributes, carefully written obituaries, retrospectives ready to roll. This was not that. This was sudden, violent, according to authorities, and wrapped in a sense of disbelief that didn't fade as the hours passed. The first reports came in quietly, almost cautiously. News outlets used restrained language. Law enforcement statements were clipped, factual, deliberate, but the reaction was anything but quiet. Phones buzzed across studio lots. Publicists scrambled. Producers, actors, writers, people who had worked with Rob Reiner decades ago, and people who had never met him personally, all stopped what they were doing. Because Rob Reiner wasn't just another filmmaker. He was a reference point. If you grew up watching American film and television, his work didn't just entertain you. It shaped you. It was quoted, debated, rewatched, shared across generations. And Michelle wasn't a footnote in that story. She was his producing partner, his collaborator, someone deeply embedded in both his professional and personal life. They were not supposed to go like this. And certainly not together. As confirmation came in that the couple had been found deceased in their Brentwood home, the language shifted. What had started as shock hardened into something darker. Law enforcement confirmed the deaths were being investigated as a homicide. That word changed everything. Homicide doesn't just describe a cause of death. It introduces uncertainty. It invites questions. It forces people to imagine scenarios they would rather avoid. And then, within hours, another detail emerged that turned disbelief into something closer to collective paralysis. A suspect had been identified. Their son. Now pause here, because this is the moment where stories often spin out of control. And it matters, deeply, to be clear about what is known, what is alleged, and what remains unresolved. According to statements from the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office, the couple's 32-year-old son, Nick Reiner, was arrested on suspicion of first-degree murder. Authorities alleged that Rob and Michelle Reiner died from multiple sharp force injuries. The manner of death was ruled a homicide. Those are legal allegations, not conclusions. An arraignment date was set. The legal process was only beginning. But in the court of public reaction, the damage was instant. Because people don't process tragedy slowly anymore. They process it in real time, online, with speculation layered on top of speculation. And suddenly, a family tragedy became a national fixation. What made it even harder to comprehend was the contrast. This wasn't a family known for public chaos. There were no years of tabloid drama, no reality show confessions, no steady drip of scandal. This was a family largely defined, at least publicly, by stability, which made the question unavoidable. What went wrong? The media coverage exploded outward in waves. First the headlines, then the think pieces, then the commentary disguised as concern. Some focused on Rob Reiner's legacy. Others zeroed in on the criminal allegations. Some tried to hold both truths at once, that a celebrated life had ended, and that the circumstances were deeply disturbing. And through all of it, one thing was painfully clear. This was not a story the family could control. In the immediate aftermath, there were no emotional interviews, no dramatic appearances, just silence. And that silence spoke volumes. Because while the world tried to make sense of what had happened, the surviving children were doing something else entirely. They were grieving. Jake Reiner and Romy Reiner were suddenly thrust into an impossible position. They weren't just mourning their parents. They were doing it while the most unbearable questions imaginable hovered over their family name. A few days later, they released a statement. It wasn't long. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't explanatory. It was raw. They spoke of unimaginable pain, of devastation that words could not capture. They described Rob and Michelle not as public figures, but as parents, as best friends, as the center of their world. And then they asked for something that felt almost radical in today's media environment. Respect, privacy, compassion. They asked that speculation be tempered with humanity, that their parents be remembered for the lives they lived, not the way they died. It was a plea that cut straight through the noise. And yet, even as many people expressed sympathy, the machinery of attention didn't slow down, because something else was now looming. A memorial service. The children confirmed they were planning a ceremony to honor their parents. Details would be shared later, they said, once the family was ready. On the surface, that sounds straightforward, almost routine. But nothing about this situation was routine. Planning a memorial under normal circumstances is emotionally taxing. Planning one under the shadow of an ongoing criminal case is something else entirely. Every decision becomes loaded. Who speaks? Who attends? What is said? And what is deliberately left unsaid? Do you make it public, knowing the press will dissect every moment? Or private, knowing that absence will be interpreted as secrecy? And how do you honor two lives without inviting the story to turn into something darker? Hollywood insiders quietly admitted this was unprecedented territory. Not legally. Tragedies involving public figures do happen, but emotionally, culturally, symbolically. Rob Reiner's career meant that his death would never be just personal. It would always be collective. But the manner of his death made that collective grief uncomfortable, complicated, even conflicted. People didn't know how to talk about it. Some tried to separate the art from the tragedy. Others couldn't look past the allegations. Some felt guilty even consuming the news, as if attention itself was a kind of intrusion. And yet, the story kept pulling people back in, because there was another layer that hadn't yet been fully confronted. Rob Reiner was also survived by his adopted daughter, Tracy Reiner, the daughter of his former wife, Penny Marshall. Her presence added another emotional dimension to the unfolding narrative, a reminder that families are complex, layered, and bound by love in ways that don't fit headlines. As days passed, one thing became increasingly obvious. This wasn't just the story of two deaths. It was the story of a family trying to hold itself together while the world watched through a magnifying glass. And as the planned memorial drew closer, the tension grew. Because funerals aren't just about saying goodbye. They're about deciding how a story is told when the people at its center can no longer speak. Will Rob Reiner be remembered primarily as the filmmaker, who shaped generations? Or will his legacy forever carry the weight of how his life ended? Will Michelle be honored for her work, her partnership, her influence? Or reduced to a tragic footnote in a narrative she didn't choose? And perhaps the most painful question of all, how do Jake and Romy stand in front of the world, if they choose to, and ask for compassion, knowing that compassion is not what the internet does best? The memorial had not yet taken place. Details were still forthcoming. But already, expectations were forming. Assumptions were hardening. Interpretations were being written before a single word was spoken. And behind all of it, the legal process was moving forward, slow and methodical, indifferent to emotion. An arraignment date had been set, which meant that no matter how the memorial unfolded, this story was not approaching closure. It was approaching escalation, because the next phase wouldn't be about shock. It would be about scrutiny. And once scrutiny begins, even the smallest details take on enormous significance. Details that, very soon, would come under a level of attention the family never asked for. And when those details finally surfaced, they would shift the entire conversation in ways no one was prepared for. What if the place you felt safest became the place the world would never stop talking about? That question hovered over everything next, because as the shock of the headlines began to settle, attention shifted away from Hollywood stages and red carpets and towards something far more intimate. A house, not a mansion people toured, not a public landmark. A private home in Brentwood, tucked behind gates and hedges, designed for quiet evenings and ordinary routines. And suddenly, that home became the center of a national obsession. Because once authorities confirmed where Rob and Michelle Reiner were found, the story changed shape again. It stopped being abstract. It became physical, spatial, specific. People wanted to know what kind of place it was. They wanted to know what happened inside. And they wanted to know how something so devastating could unfold in a space meant for safety. This is always how it goes. The moment tragedy enters a home, curiosity follows. But this wasn't curiosity born from care. It was the kind that dissects floor plans and speculates about timelines. The kind that imagines moments no one should ever have to imagine. And yet, even as interest intensified, officials were careful. They released information slowly, deliberately, without graphic detail, without emotional language. The couple had been discovered in their residence in the afternoon. Authorities described the deaths as the result of sharp force injuries. The manner of death was ruled a homicide. That was it. No reenactments, no lurid descriptions, no speculation from law enforcement. And still, the absence of detail created a vacuum, and vacuums get filled. Online, the house itself became symbolic. Commentators described it as serene, affluent, protected, the kind of place where nothing bad was supposed to happen, which raised an unsettling contradiction. If this could happen here, where could it not happen? Neighbors were quoted expressing disbelief. Shock. They spoke about quiet streets, familiar faces, normal routines. Nothing seemed out of place. And yet, everything was. Inside the industry, people reacted differently. Some understood immediately why details were scarce. When a case involves family, everything becomes more sensitive. Every word has consequences, legal, emotional, irreversible. Others weren't as patient. They demanded timelines. They demanded explanations. They demanded a story that made sense. But this wasn't a story that wanted to cooperate. Because as investigators worked methodically behind the scenes, the public narrative began to drift, and drift quickly. Some people tried to impose logic where there was none. They searched for warning signs, for old interviews, for stray quotes that could be retroactively reframed as foreshadowing. Others recoiled entirely, unable to reconcile the image they had of Rob Reiner with the reality now confronting them. And then there were those who focused on something else entirely. The silence. No photos released. No detailed press conferences. No emotional statements from authorities. Just process. And that silence became a Rorschach test. To some, it signaled respect. To others, secrecy. To a few, something more ominous. But here's what often gets lost in moments like this. Homes don't tell stories. People do. And the people closest to this story weren't talking because they were in shock. Jake and Romy Reiner were not giving interviews. They were not correcting rumors. They were not managing optics. They were dealing with the kind of grief that makes time feel unreal. Think about that. One moment, Your parents exist in the world. They are phone calls, dinners, text messages, plans. The next, they are gone. And the place where you once felt welcomed now feels haunted. But because the world had begun to project its own expectations onto a goodbye that hadn't yet been planned. Some expected a public reckoning. Others hoped for a private ceremony. Some wanted clarity. Others wanted distance. And that tension was building towards something inevitable. Because eventually, the family would have to step forward or step back. And either choice would be interpreted. The house may have been quiet now, but the story surrounding it was anything but. And soon, attention would shift away from walls and rooms and towards something even more emotionally volatile. The family's first public words. Words that would be analyzed, weighed, and remembered, not just for what they said, but for what they didn't. Because when those words finally came, they would reshape the entire narrative. What do you do when the name everyone is whispering is your brother's? That's the moment this story crossed a line no one was prepared for. Because shock is one thing, grief is another. But betrayal, even alleged, even unresolved, carries a weight that rewrites every relationship in its path. When authorities announced that Nick Reiner had been arrested on suspicion of first-degree murder, the reaction was immediate and visceral. Not because the public knew him well, most didn't, but because the idea itself was unbearable. A son, parents, one sentence that should never exist in the same breath. And suddenly, the tragedy was no longer something people could observe from a distance. It became intimate in the most uncomfortable way possible. Because families are where we place our deepest assumptions about safety, loyalty, and unconditional love. So when that assumption fractures, people don't just react, they recoil. But here's where things get complicated. Because this wasn't a case where years of public warning signs could be stitched together into a neat narrative. There were no tabloid trails. No viral breakdowns. No dramatic public estrangements playing out in front of cameras. Instead, there was absence. And absence invites projection. Within hours of the arrest becoming public, the internet began doing what it always does in moments like this. It tried to build a story faster than the facts could arrive. Who was Nick Reiner, really? What was his relationship with his parents? Were there hidden tensions no one talked about? Questions multiplied. Answers did not. And that imbalance, questions without answers, is where damage happens. Legally, the process was straightforward, if emotionally devastating. Authorities alleged that Rob and Michelle Reiner had died from multiple sharp force injuries. The manner of death was ruled homicide. Nick Reiner was held without bail. An arraignment date was scheduled for January 7th. Those are procedural facts. Cold, clinical, necessary. But behind those facts was a family collapsing inward. Because Jake and Romy Reiner weren't just watching a sibling face criminal allegations. They were processing the loss of their parents while the world asked them to comment on the unthinkable. And they didn't. They couldn't. They chose silence. Not because they had something to hide, but because anything they said would be interpreted through a lens they could not control. Silence, in moments like this, becomes both shield and weapon. To supporters, it signaled restraint and grief. To skeptics, it felt evasive. To the family, it was survival. What many people failed to grasp was the legal reality. In cases involving immediate family members, every public statement carries risk. Words can be twisted. Timelines can be misinterpreted. Emotional expressions can be reframed as intent. So the safest option, emotionally and legally, is often to say nothing at all. But the public isn't wired for patience. Once a suspect is named, neutrality evaporates. People choose sides. They demand clarity. They want the story to resolve itself into something they can understand. And when that doesn't happen quickly, frustration sets in. Some commentators rushed to judgment, treating allegations as conclusions. Others pushed back, insisting on due process, reminding audiences that an arrest is not a verdict. That divide became one of the defining tensions of the story, because both impulses came from somewhere human. One from horror, the other from caution. But neither brought comfort to the people actually living inside the nightmare. Inside the family, dynamics shifted in ways outsiders could only guess at. Grief is already isolating. Add public scrutiny and legal stakes, and it becomes suffocating. Every memory gets re-examined. Every conversation replayed. Every ordinary moment retroactively questioned. Did this mean something? Did we miss a sign? Could this have been prevented? These are the questions that haunt families after tragedy, even when there is no logical answer. And yet, the presence of criminal allegations amplifies that pain exponentially. Because now grief is intertwined with doubt. Love collides with disbelief. And loyalty becomes a minefield. Publicly, Jake and Romy's statement avoided naming their brother at all. That omission was deliberate, not because they were erasing him, but because acknowledging him publicly would have turned their grief into a spectacle. Instead, they centered their parents. They spoke of love, of friendship, of loss. They asked for compassion. That choice mattered, because it signaled something important. This memorial, whenever it happened, would not be about the crime. It would be about the lives that were lost. At least, that was the intention. But intentions don't always survive contact with reality. As the days passed, media narratives hardened. Headlines simplified. Social media distilled a complex legal and emotional situation into shareable conclusions. And with each new article, the space for nuance shrank. This is the cruel paradox of high-profile cases. The more attention they receive, the less room there is for uncertainty. And uncertainty is exactly where the truth usually lives. Behind the scenes, legal teams prepared. Procedures advanced. The case moved forward at its own pace, indifferent to public emotion, which meant the family was trapped between two timelines. One moving painfully fast, public judgment. The other moving agonizingly slow, the justice system. And in the middle of those timelines sat the memorial. Because no matter what the family chose, the ceremony would be interpreted as a statement. If Nick Reiner's name was mentioned, people would analyze the language. If it wasn't, they would read meaning into the omission. If the service was private, it would be called secretive. If public, it would be accused of inviting spectacle. There was no winning, only choosing which pain to absorb. And that's when another uncomfortable reality emerged. This wasn't just Rob Reiner's funeral. It was Michelle's too. And Michelle's story risked being overshadowed by the circumstances entirely. Friends and colleagues who had worked closely with her began quietly expressing concern that her legacy would be flattened into a single headline. That her years of partnership, creativity, and influence would be reduced to context rather than substance. That fear added another layer of urgency to the memorial planning. How do you honor two lives, fully, honestly, when one part of the story threatens to eclipse everything else? The answer isn't obvious, and it certainly isn't easy. As the arraignment date approached, tension grew. Not publicly, the family remained silent, but emotionally, among those close to the situation. Because once court proceedings began, every detail would become public record. Transcripts, testimony, evidence. Things no family ever wants to see attached to their parents' names, which made the memorial feel like a narrowing window. A moment, perhaps the only one, where Rob and Michelle could be remembered without interruption, without footnotes, without legal qualifiers. But even that hope felt fragile, because the world doesn't pause for grief. And stories like this don't wait for emotional readiness. The arrest had changed everything. It reframed the tragedy. It intensified scrutiny. It guaranteed that this would not fade quietly. And as the family prepared, emotionally, privately, to say goodbye, another truth became clear. Whatever happened next would define not just how Rob Reiner was remembered, but how his family would carry that memory forward. Because once the legal process begins, narratives harden. And the next chapter of this story would not unfold in a home, but in a courtroom. How do you speak when every word risks becoming a headline? That was the impossible crossroads Jake and Romy Reiner faced as the world leaned in closer, waiting, not patiently, for them to say something. Anything. Silence, after all, makes people uneasy. And unease invites interpretation. For days after the arrest, there were no interviews, no appearances, no carefully staged statements delivered through attorneys. Just absence. And that absence became loud. Commentators began asking questions that sounded reasonable on the surface, but carried an edge underneath. Why hadn't they spoken? Were they being advised not to? Were they choosing sides? Were they hiding something? It was a familiar pattern. Grief, when it doesn't perform publicly, is often treated with suspicion. But what people forget, or ignore, is that grief doesn't arrive with a media strategy. When Jake and Romy finally did release a statement, it didn't come with fanfare. It didn't break news cycles with sensational language. It arrived quietly, through established outlets, written with the kind of restraint that only comes from pain too deep to dramatize. And the first thing it did was shatter expectations. There was no defensiveness, no explanation, no attempt to control the narrative. Just loss. They described their pain as unimaginable. Not dramatic, not poetic, just unimaginable. The kind of word people use when they've exhausted language and still haven't come close to what they're feeling. They didn't frame Rob and Michelle as icons. They framed them as parents, as best friends, as the people who anchored their lives. That choice mattered more than people realized. Because in a moment when the public wanted answers, Jake and Romy offered something else entirely: humanity. They refused to let the conversation be hijacked by speculation. They refused to reduce their parents to a crime story. And perhaps most striking of all, they asked for restraint. They asked that speculation be tempered with compassion and humanity. Read that again. Not stopped, not silenced, tempered. It was a realistic request, one that acknowledged the world's attention without endorsing its excesses. But restraint is hard to enforce once curiosity has momentum. The statement also included something else, something subtle but powerful. They made it clear that information about a memorial service would be shared later. Not now. Not yet. Later. That single word carried layers of meaning. On one level, it was practical. The family was still in shock, still grieving, still navigating legal and emotional chaos. On another level, it was a boundary. It said, this moment belongs to us. And boundaries, when drawn publicly, tend to provoke reactions. Some people respected it immediately. Messages of support poured in from colleagues, friends, and strangers who recognized the courage it took to speak at all. Others weren't as kind. Social media dissected the wording. People parsed sentences as if they were legal documents instead of expressions of grief. Entire threads were devoted to what wasn't said. Why didn't they mention their brother? Why didn't they address the allegations directly? Why didn't they thank law enforcement? The answer, of course, is simple. Because this wasn't a press conference. It was a family asking for space to mourn. But simplicity rarely survives in public tragedy. What made their statement even more poignant was its timing. It came at a moment when the narrative was threatening to tip fully into sensationalism, when headlines risked overshadowing the people at the center of the loss. By speaking then, briefly, carefully, Jake and Romy reclaimed a sliver of control. They reminded the world that before this was a case, it was a family. And before it was a headline, it was a life. 2 lives, abruptly ended. Still, the reaction revealed an uncomfortable truth. In high-profile tragedies, families are often expected to perform grief in a way that satisfies public curiosity. Too emotional, and they're accused of dramatics. Too restrained, and they're accused of coldness. Too silent, and they're accused of hiding something. There is no winning script. And Jake and Romy weren't trying to win anything. They were trying to survive. Behind the scenes, sources close to the family described an atmosphere of exhaustion. Not just physical exhaustion, but emotional depletion. The kind that comes from being asked, over and over again, to respond to something you don't yet understand yourself. Imagine waking up every morning to notifications about your parents' deaths. Imagine seeing strangers argue about your family's private pain as if it were a puzzle to be solved. And imagine doing all of that while planning a memorial. Because the statement wasn't just about grief. It was about logistics, about decisions that felt impossible. Who would speak at the service? Would it be religious or secular? Private or public? Small or symbolic? Every option came with consequences. A private service might protect the family, but would invite accusations of secrecy. A public one might honor Rob and Michelle's influence, but risk turning the ceremony into spectacle. And then there was the question no one wanted to ask out loud. Would the legal situation cast a shadow over the memorial no matter what they did? Jake and Romy knew this. They weren't naive. They understood how stories like this evolve. They also understood something else, something many outside the situation did not. Memorials aren't about closure. They're about acknowledgement. They don't solve anything. They don't answer questions. They don't make sense of the senseless. They simply mark a loss. And that was all Jake and Romy were trying to do. But the world, restless and impatient, wanted more. They wanted explanations. They wanted clarity. They wanted the story to settle into something consumable. And that tension between a family's need to grieve and the public's desire to understand only grew as days passed. Because the statement, as measured and compassionate as it was, did something unexpected. It shifted sympathy. People who had been hovering on the edges of the story, unsure how to feel, suddenly saw Jake and Romy not as figures in a scandal, but as children enduring something unimaginable. That shift didn't erase speculation, but it complicated it. And complication is dangerous for simple narratives. As more people shared the statement, conversations changed tone. Some commentators urged others to slow down, to remember that real people were involved. Others doubled down, arguing that public interest justified scrutiny. The divide widened. And all the while, Jake and Romy said nothing more. They didn't follow up. They didn't clarify. They didn't respond to critics. They let the statement stand on its own. That restraint, intentional or not, became its own message. It suggested that whatever came next would not be rushed. That the memorial, when announced, would be shaped by meaning, not pressure. But pressure has a way of building regardless. As the legal process continued quietly in the background, media outlets began speculating about what the memorial might look like, which figures might attend, which absences would be noticed. And one question kept resurfacing. Would the service address the circumstances at all? Some believed it had to, that ignoring the context would feel dishonest. Others argued the opposite, that memorials are for lives, not investigations. Jake and Romy, caught between these expectations, were forced to navigate something no one prepares you for. They weren't just grieving children. They were now guardians of a legacy that belonged to millions, but also, first and foremost, to them. And as they weighed their next steps, one thing became increasingly clear. The memorial would not simply reflect who Rob and Michelle were. It would signal how the family intended to move forward. And that signal, whether subtle or explicit, would shape public perception in ways no statement ever could. Because words can ask for compassion, but actions define boundaries. And soon, the family would have to make a choice that would speak louder than anything they had said so far. A choice that would set the tone for everything that followed. How do you plan a goodbye when the story refuses to stay still? That was the question hanging over every quiet conversation, every late-night phone call, every moment Jake and Romy tried to think practically while their emotions were still raw. Because planning a memorial is hard under the best circumstances. Planning one when your family's name is attached to an ongoing criminal case is something else entirely. And the pressure didn't come all at once. It crept in. At first, it was subtle. A well-meaning friend asking if there was anything they could help with. A colleague quietly offering a venue suggestion. Someone else gently asking whether the service would be public or private. Normal questions. Reasonable questions. But nothing about this was normal. Because every option carried weight far beyond logistics. Take privacy. A private memorial would allow the family to grieve without cameras, without commentary, without the feeling of being watched. It would create a protected space where emotion didn't have to be measured, where tears didn't have to be dignified. But privacy comes with a cost when the person being remembered is a public figure. People would ask why they were excluded. Headlines would frame the choice as secrecy. Silence would be interpreted as avoidance. Now take the opposite option. A public memorial would honor Rob and Michelle's impact. It would give colleagues, collaborators, and admirers a chance to say goodbye. It would acknowledge that these lives matter to more than just one family. But public means performance. Public means every expression becomes a data point. Every speaker is analyzed. Every pause is interpreted. Every absence is noticed. And worst of all, public means that the story might shift away from remembrance and back toward speculation, right there in the room. That fear loomed large. Because no matter how carefully planned, the memorial could not exist in a vacuum. It would unfold against a backdrop of unresolved questions, active investigations, and a public hungry for meaning. The family understood something instinctively. You only get one chance to frame a goodbye. Once it happens, it becomes part of the permanent record. Clips are replayed. Quotes are archived. Reactions are frozen in time. And if it goes wrong, if the focus slips, if the narrative derails, you don't get to redo it. So planning slowed. Not because the family didn't care, but because they cared too much. Behind the scenes, discussions weren't just about dates and locations. They were about tone, about intention, About boundaries. Would there be eulogies? If so, who would deliver them? Family only? Friends? Colleagues? Would Rob's career be front and center? Or would the focus stay firmly on his role as a husband and father? So silence becomes safer. But safe doesn't always feel kind. For fans watching from the outside, the quiet felt jarring. Rob Reiner had been a towering figure in film and television. His absence should have produced a tidal wave of remembrance. Instead, there was a strange unevenness. And that unevenness fed a growing sense of unease. Some wondered whether people were waiting for more information before speaking. Others suspected that the circumstances had created an unspoken rule. Tread lightly, or don't tread at all. Behind the scenes, that instinct was very real. Publicists advised restraint. Studios avoided statements that might later feel premature. Colleagues debated privately whether speaking publicly might inadvertently complicate matters for the family. And while many of these choices were made with good intentions, the effect was unmistakable. The silence felt loud. For Jake and Romy, watching this unfold was another layer of emotional strain. Grief already isolates. Public grief isolates even more. But when familiar voices don't speak up, that isolation can deepen into something heavier. Not resentment, just sadness. Because silence can feel like distance, even when it isn't meant that way. At the same time, there were voices that did break through. People who focused not on the tragedy, but on Rob's impact, on Michelle's work, on the years of collaboration, mentorship, and creative partnership that defined their lives. These tributes mattered. They reframed the conversation, even briefly. They reminded people that before this was a crisis, it was a career, a marriage, a life. But they were islands in a quieter than expected sea. And then, quietly at first, attention shifted again. Toward absence. Toward who wasn't being mentioned. Toward a name that hadn't yet entered the public memorial conversation in any meaningful way. Tracy Reiner. Rob Reiner's adopted daughter, and the daughter of his former wife, Penny Marshall, had always occupied a unique place in his life story. Adopted not as a formality, but as an affirmation of family beyond biology. Her relationship with Rob was well known to those who followed his life closely, but less familiar to the general public. And as the story unfolded, people began to ask quietly, then more openly, where she fit into this moment. Would she speak? Would she attend? Would she be included prominently in the memorial narrative? The questions weren't invasive at first. They were curious. But curiosity has a way of sharpening when answers don't arrive. Tracy did not rush to the spotlight. She didn't issue statements timed to news cycles. She didn't appear on camera. She grieved privately, away from the churn of commentary. To those who understood her, this made perfect sense. To others, it became another blank space to fill. And blank spaces never stay empty for long. Some speculated about family dynamics. Others wondered whether the complexity of the situation had discouraged public expressions. Still others projected their own assumptions onto a relationship they didn't fully understand. What got lost in all of that was something simple. Families don't grieve on schedules. And they don't grieve in unison. Everyone processes loss differently. Some speak. Some withdraw. Some need time before words feel possible. Hollywood, however, is not patient with that reality. The industry thrives on immediacy, on reaction, on visible emotion. So when responses don't conform to expectation, they're often misread. The result was a strange dual narrative. On one side, genuine mourning. On the other, an interpretive exercise fueled by silence. And in between, a family trying to hold itself together. As days passed, the imbalance became more pronounced. Tributes continued sporadically, but the absence of a unified Hollywood response became part of the story itself. Articles were written about who had spoken and who hadn't. Lists circulated. Comparisons were drawn. This kind of attention may seem trivial compared to the gravity of loss, but it has real consequences. It shapes perception. It influences how a legacy is framed in the public imagination. And it adds pressure to moments that should be allowed to unfold naturally. For Jake and Romy, the uneven reaction reinforced a difficult truth. They could not control how the world responded to their parents' deaths. They could only control how they responded. And that meant doubling down on intention. They were not going to chase validation. They were not going to demand statements. They were not going to manage Hollywood's emotions for it. Their focus remained on the memorial, on honoring Rob and Michelle in a way that felt true, not performative. But the shifting reactions around them made one thing clear. Whatever happened at the memorial would be scrutinized not just for what was said, but for who said it. If certain figures appeared, it would be interpreted as support. If they didn't, it would be read as distance. If someone spoke publicly afterward, their words would be dissected. The memorial was becoming a litmus test, not by the family's design, but by public expectation. And expectations were hardening fast. Hollywood may have been quiet, but it was watching and waiting, because the industry understands symbolism perhaps better than anyone. Who shows up matters. Who doesn't matters. Who is named matters. Who is omitted matters. As the days ticked closer to an announcement about the service, tension grew, not just emotionally, but culturally. People wanted to know what kind of moment this would be. A reckoning? A tribute? A carefully controlled farewell? The silence from some corners only heightened anticipation, because when voices finally speak after a pause, they tend to land harder. And in this case, the next voices to emerge wouldn't come from Hollywood at all. They would come from the family itself. And what they chose to reveal, or not reveal, would shift the story yet again. What does it mean to belong when the family story keeps changing? That question followed Tracy Reiner quietly through this unfolding tragedy, even as her name rarely appeared in headlines. Not because she was absent, but because her role didn't fit neatly into the version of the story the public wanted to tell. And stories like neat lines. They like clear definitions, biological ties, obvious hierarchies, simple labels. But families don't work that way. And Tracy Reiner's place in Rob Reiner's life had always been a reminder of that truth. She was not his biological child. That detail is often stated first, as if it needs clarification. But what mattered far more, and what those closest to the family understood instinctively, was that she was chosen. Adopted by Rob Reiner after his marriage to Penny Marshall, Tracy grew up not on the margins of his life, but inside it. He didn't treat her as an extension of a previous relationship. He treated her as his daughter. Full stop. For years, that bond had been visible in quiet ways. In appearances, in interviews, in how Rob spoke about family, not as something fixed by blood, but as something built by commitment. And yet, as the tragedy unfolded, Tracy's presence became a kind of question mark for the outside world. Not because she didn't belong, but because people didn't know where to place her. Would she speak publicly? Would she attend the memorial? Would she be mentioned in official statements? The absence of immediate answers triggered speculation. Not loud at first, but persistent. Some framed it as distance, others as intentional silence. A few, unfairly, as disengagement. But that interpretation ignored something essential. Tracy had already lived much of her life navigating public narratives that weren't of her making. She understood better than most how easily words could be twisted, how quickly moments of vulnerability could become fodder for commentary. So when she chose privacy, it wasn't avoidance. It was self-protection. And perhaps it was also respect. Because while the public was dissecting timelines and roles, Tracy was grieving in a way that didn't require an audience. Those close to her described a quiet devastation. Not performative, not public-facing. The kind of grief that settles deep and stays there. Rob Reiner wasn't just a famous father figure. He was the man who chose her, who raised her, who stood by her through decades of life changes, who defined what family meant beyond biology. And Michelle, too, had been part of that chosen family, a presence woven into Tracy's adult life through shared history, holidays, and moments that never made it into interviews. So when the world began speculating about Tracy's place in the memorial, those who knew the family well felt a familiar frustration. Once again, complexity was being flattened. Once again, silence was being mistaken for absence. What made this particularly painful was the contrast between Tracy's relationship with Rob and the way the story was being framed publicly. The narrative, increasingly, revolved around nuclear family structure, parents, sons, legal proceedings, leaving little room for nuance. But Tracy's connection to Rob didn't disappear just because it didn't fit the headline. It existed regardless. And that raised another uncomfortable question. How would the memorial reflect that complexity? Would Tracy be acknowledged alongside Jake and Romy? Would her role be understood by those watching from the outside? Or would she become another footnote in a story already crowded with assumptions? Memorials, after all, don't just honor the dead. They signal belonging. They communicate who is recognized as part of the inner circle, not explicitly, but symbolically. Who stands where? Who speaks? Who is named? Those choices speak volumes. For Jake and Romy, this wasn't theoretical. It was deeply personal. Tracy wasn't an abstract concept. She was their sister, not by blood, but by shared history. And like everything else surrounding this tragedy, that relationship existed outside public understanding, which made decisions about representation even more sensitive. Because in moments like this, families are often judged not on intention, but on optics. If Tracy spoke, people would analyze her words. If she didn't, they would analyze her silence. If she was mentioned, they would parse the phrasing. If she wasn't, they would question the omission. There was no version of events that would satisfy everyone, and Tracy knew that. So she chose distance from the noise, not from the family, but from the performance. That choice, however, did not go unnoticed. In Hollywood circles, her quiet presence and lack of public commentary was understood as a sign of restraint. Many admired it. Some even envied it. Because restraint is hard when emotions are high and attention is relentless. But restraint is also easily misinterpreted. And soon, the question of Tracy's role intersected with a larger issue. Legacy. Rob Reiner's legacy was already being debated in real time. His films, his political voice, his cultural impact. But family legacy is different. It's not about awards or box office numbers. It's about who carries the story forward. And Tracy, in her own way, was one of the carriers. Not loudly, not publicly, but undeniably. Those who had watched Rob over the years understood that family, to him, was expansive, inclusive, chosen as much as inherited, which made the narrowing of the public narrative feel particularly dissonant, as if a key part of who he was being overlooked. That dissonance added pressure to the memorial planning, not in the sense of conflict, but in the sense of responsibility. How do you honor a man who believed in chosen family without making the memorial feel like a corrective statement? How do you include complexity without inviting misinterpretation? These questions lingered, unresolved, as the days passed. And they intersected with another reality. The memorial was no longer just about remembrance. It was becoming a symbolic moment, one that would be read for clues, meaning, and intent. Tracy's presence, or absence, would be part of that reading. Not because she wanted it to be, but because the public had decided it mattered. And this is where the story took another turn. Because just as questions about Tracy's role were gaining traction, attention began shifting again. Away from family structure, away from silence, towards something far more familiar to Hollywood. Legacy framing. Who would speak about Rob's career? Which projects would be highlighted? Which relationships would be emphasized? And crucially, which ones would be left out? Because legacy is not neutral. It is curated. And the way Rob Reiner's life would be framed at the memorial would send a message, intentionally or not, about what mattered most in the end. Was it the work? The influence? The family? Or some careful combination of all three? For Tracy, watching this unfold from a distance, the tension was palpable. Not because she needed validation, but because she understood what was at stake. This memorial would help define how Rob was remembered, not just by the public, but by future generations who would encounter his story stripped of context. And context, in this case, was everything. The inclusion of chosen family, the acknowledgement of complexity, the refusal to reduce a life to its ending. All of that hung in the balance. And as the family moved closer to finalizing plans, another realization set in. The memorial wouldn't just be about who spoke. It would be about who was seen standing together. And that visual, who stood beside whom, would be interpreted far beyond its original intent. Because in high-profile tragedies, symbolism often eclipses substance. And the next chapter of this story would hinge on exactly that. Who would stand in the room when the goodbye finally happened? And who would not? What do you remember when the ending refuses to make sense? That was the question quietly reshaping the conversation as attention began drifting away from silence, speculation, and family structure, and towards something Hollywood understands instinctively. Legacy. Because when a life ends abruptly, people reach backward. They search for meaning in what came before. They rewind the reel, hoping the earlier scenes will explain the final frame. And with Rob Reiner, that reel was long, influential, and deeply embedded in American culture. Before the tragedy, before the headlines, before the house, the investigation, the questions, there was the work, there was the voice, there was a career that didn't just reflect Hollywood, it shaped it. For many, the instinct was immediate. Separate the man from the moment. Remember the films. Remember the laughter. Remember the lines that became shorthand for entire emotions. That instinct wasn't denial. It was survival, because it's easier to grieve what you understand than what you don't. Rob Reiner's career spanned decades, genres, and cultural shifts. He wasn't confined to one era or one kind of storytelling. He moved between comedy, drama, romance, satire, often with an intuitive understanding of what audiences needed before they knew it themselves. His work didn't just entertain. It connected. People met each other through his films, quoted them, built memories around them, found language for feelings they couldn't articulate yet. And that's the kind of legacy that doesn't disappear just because the ending is complicated. But legacy is never just about output. It's about intention. And Rob Reiner was known for having one. He believed stories mattered. He believed art carried responsibility. He believed humor could coexist with seriousness. That laughter didn't cheapen truth, but sometimes made it easier to face. Those beliefs shaped not just his films, but his presence in the industry. He wasn't a recluse. He wasn't a mystery. He spoke. He engaged. He argued. He cared, sometimes loudly. And that caring earned him admiration and criticism. But even critics acknowledged something undeniable. Rob Reiner was never indifferent. And then there was Michelle. Michelle Singer Reiner was often described in public narratives as a partner, a producer, a collaborator. But those words don't fully capture her role. She was a stabilizing force. Someone who worked alongside Rob not for visibility, but for impact. Someone whose influence was felt in decisions that never made it to press releases. Those close to them often described their partnership as balanced, creative tension softened by mutual respect. They challenged each other, supported each other, built something together that extended beyond individual projects, which made their joint loss feel especially destabilizing. Because when people tried to separate Rob's legacy from the tragedy, they quickly realized it couldn't be done without acknowledging Michelle's presence. She wasn't adjacent to the work. She was part of its architecture. As tributes trickled in, some public, many private, a pattern emerged. Those who knew them best spoke not about awards or accolades, but about consistency, about showing up, about loyalty, about long conversations and shared convictions. This wasn't the mythology of celebrity. It was the texture of real life. And that texture mattered now more than ever. Because in the absence of closure, people clung to continuity. They wanted reassurance that the life they admired hadn't been erased by the way it ended. But legacy isn't a shield. It doesn't block questions. It doesn't erase discomfort. It doesn't protect families from pain. What it does do is offer context. And context is the enemy of sensationalism. As retrospectives began circulating, some viewers noticed something interesting. Rob Reiner's work often explored trust, friendship tested, love complicated, morality challenged. His stories didn't shy away from conflict. They leaned into it, not to glorify it, but to understand it. In hindsight, that felt haunting. Not because his films predicted anything. They didn't, but because they revealed how deeply he understood human complexity. Which made the impulse to flatten his story into a single ending feel especially wrong. People who had never met him but felt shaped by his work began pushing back against reductive narratives. They shared clips, essays, personal anecdotes about what his films meant to them at pivotal moments in their lives. This wasn't about defending anyone. It was about resisting erasure. Because when tragedy becomes all-consuming, it has a way of swallowing everything else. And many people weren't ready to let that happen. Still, there was tension. Some argued that focusing on legacy too quickly felt like avoidance, like a refusal to confront the reality of what happened. Others argued the opposite, that refusing to honor the life because of the ending was a kind of cruelty. That debate unfolded quietly, but persistently, and it mirrored the family's own internal struggle. How do you honor a life without appearing to dismiss the gravity of its end? How do you celebrate achievements without ignoring accountability? How do you hold complexity without collapsing into contradiction? There are no universal answers to those questions, but the memorial would require choices. And those choices would signal priorities. Would the service emphasize Rob's career? Would it foreground Michelle's contributions? Would it focus on family? Or would it attempt to balance all three? Each approach would tell a different story. Hollywood insiders understood this instinctively. They knew memorials aren't neutral. They are curated moments of meaning.